Easter 1900. The deep blue waters of the Aegean Sea churned around the rocky shores of Antikythera, a small island between Crete and the Peloponnese. Captain Dimitrios Kondos was navigating his sponge diving vessel past the island's northern coast when a violent storm struck. As the boat was battered by massive waves, Kondos made a critical decision. Instead of attempting to return to port, they would seek shelter in a protected bay on Antikythera. This decision would trigger one of the most important archaeological discoveries in history. When the storm subsided the next day, Kondos and his crew faced an unexpected problem. The sponge divers working underwater needed to dive to retrieve ropes and equipment that had tangled during the storm. A young diver named Ilias Stadiatis descended to approximately 60 meters depth. At that time, sponge divers used primitive air pump equipment. A pump on the surface sent air down through a long hose. The technology was rudimentary and dangerous. Decompression sickness was common and often fatal. Every dive was a gamble with death. When Stadiatis reached the seabed, what he saw shocked him. Among the rocks, he saw human figures, arms, legs, faces. His first thought was corpses, an ancient disaster perhaps, recently drowned sailors. He surfaced in panic, gasping, trying to explain what he'd seen. Bodies, so many bodies, down there among the rocks. Captain Kondos was skeptical. Stadiatis wasn't an old, experienced diver. Perhaps the deep water had a psychological effect on him, nitrogen narcosis, the condition divers called rapture of the deep. But Stadiatis insisted he had seen those bodies. Kondos decided to descend himself to see the situation with his own eyes. 60 meters depth is dangerous even for an experienced diver. Kondos descended slowly, passing through darkening water as light diminished. When he reached the seabed, he saw that Stadiatis was right, but they weren't corpses. Statues, bronze and marble statues covered with centuries of marine growth, encrusted with seaweed and shells. An outstretched arm, a torso, an intricately carved horse head. But this wasn't just statues. Around them was wreckage, remains of wood, amphorae, metal objects. This was a shipwreck, an ancient ship. Kondos returned to the surface with excitement. He knew what they'd found, a historical wreck, probably 2,000 years old or older, still carrying its cargo. For a sponge diving captain, this was a treasure. But Kondos was also practical. Such a discovery should be reported to Greek authorities. If they tried to salvage secretly and were caught, they'd face imprisonment and fines. Better to inform the government and seek permission to participate in an official salvage operation. Kondos took his boat back to the main port on Simi Island and reported to local authorities. News spread rapidly. By May 1900, the National Archaeological Museum in Athens had received word. The museum director, Valerios Stais, immediately understood the historical significance. If the wreck was truly ancient and contained its cargo, this would be an enormous scientific and cultural treasure for Greece. But there was a problem. Nobody had experience with this type of underwater recovery operation. In 1900, underwater archaeology didn't yet exist as a discipline. Scientists, archaeologists, and museum experts didn't know how to excavate such a wreck. The only experienced underwater workers were sponge divers, but they were trained to collect sponges, not salvage artifacts. Nobody had ever attempted anything like this before. The Greek government made a pragmatic decision. Captain Kondos and his crew would be authorized to conduct the official salvage operation supported by the Greek Royal Navy. The Navy would provide equipment and logistical support. Kondos's divers would do the actual underwater work, and archaeologists from Athens would document and preserve the recovered objects. The operation would begin in November 1900. Preparations took months. Additional divers were hired to support Kondos's crew. The Greek Royal Navy assigned a powerful ship for the salvage operation, a corvette named Mycale. The ship was equipped with heavy winches, rope systems, and special equipment for underwater work. Archaeologist Spiridon Stais, the museum director's brother, was assigned to supervise the operation.
When everything was arranged, the Macquarie set sail for Antikythera on November 24, 1900. The site was a challenging working area. Antikythera is in one of the Aegean's most stormy regions. Currents are strong, weather changes rapidly, and the wreck itself was at 60 meters depth, near the absolute maximum depth for divers with air pump equipment. Divers could only make 2 short dives per day. More than that would raise the risk of decompression sickness to unacceptable levels. Work began. Each day, divers would descend in rotation. Each dive lasted approximately 5 minutes. Down from the surface, 2 to 3 minutes of work on the seabed, then a careful ascent. 5 minutes sounds trivial, but at 60 meters depth, in high pressure and cold water, it was mentally and physically exhausting. Divers would tie ropes around objects, and the surface crew would haul them up. The system was slow and dangerous, but it worked.
The first recoveries were magnificent. A large bronze statue of a young man, perfectly preserved. Marble statues, some broken but still recognizable. Bronze furniture, glass vessels, and amphorae. Dozens of ancient ceramic wine jars, some still sealed. As each object was brought to the surface, archaeologists would document it, clean it, and package it for transport to the museum. The collection grew day by day, but the work took a terrible toll. In December 1900, a diver, a man named Georgos, came up unconscious. Decompression sickness. The crew tried to revive him, but he was paralyzed. Later, another diver died. Pressure-related complications. Captain Kondos considered stopping the work. Was the treasure worth the cost of lives? But the decision wasn't his to make. Greek authorities ordered the work to continue. The wreck was too important. The losses were tragic, but the nation had a duty to recover this site and reclaim its civilization's history. The divers continued, understanding the risk of death. This wasn't just a job or an adventure, it was a patriotic duty. By February 1901, bad weather and increasing casualties forced work to stop. During 9 weeks of operation, the team had collected an enormous inventory. Bronze and marble statues, jewelry, glassware, bronze furniture pieces, ceramics, and dozens of amphorae. A total of approximately 36 marble sculptures and 23 bronze sculptures were recovered, though more likely remained at the wreck site, buried deeper or too fragmented to salvage. The collection was sent to Athens and put on display at the National Archaeological Museum. Public interest was immense. Newspapers proclaimed the discovery the archaeological find of the century. Scientists began examining the objects, trying to determine where the ship came from, when it sank, and whose cargo it carried. Initial analyses revealed some details. The ship's amphorae styles and the artistic style of some objects suggested the wreck dated to approximately the 1st century BC, perhaps around 70 to 60 BC. The ship was probably traveling east to west, perhaps from one of the wealthy cities of Asia Minor or the island of Rhodes, heading toward Rome. Its cargo of luxury items suggested passengers, merchants, or Roman nobility transporting goods to be displayed in museums or purchased by private collectors. But among the collection, there was one object that nobody paid much attention to at first. Divers had brought up a corroded bronze lump, about 30 centimeters by 15 centimeters in size, heavily encrusted, a clump of bronze plates fused together. On the surface, it looked like nothing special, just oxidized metal, perhaps a piece of a statue or some incomprehensible marine debris. The museum stored it with other wreckage and largely forgot about it. In May 1902, a museum staff member, exact identity not recorded but probably someone from the conservation team, noticed something while cleaning the piece. Under the metal corrosion, there were gears. Small bronze gears assembled together like in a mechanical mechanism. And on the surface were inscriptions, ancient Greek letters engraved. This was impossible. Ancient Greece didn't make mechanical clocks or complex gear systems, did they? The staff member reported the finding to Valerios Staeus. The museum director examined the object and immediately understood that this was extraordinary. This wasn't a statue piece, this was a machine, some kind of calculating device, an astronomical instrument, or something else, but definitely a deliberately crafted complex mechanism made from bronze. Staeus announced to world experts, what was the device? What did it do? And how could ancient Greece, 2,000 years ago, build something so sophisticated? These questions would launch a mystery that would occupy scientists for more than a century. The Antikythera mechanism, as it would eventually be named, became one of the most mysterious technological artifacts in world history. In 1902, nobody could solve it. The piece was too corroded, too fragile, too complex. Examining it in detail was risky. It could damage the mechanism further. And frankly, most scientists found it impossible to believe. Conventional historical knowledge didn't include Greek mechanical technology at this level. Some thought it was a fake. Others suggested it was from a later period, perhaps medieval, and accidentally included with the wreck. But these were just speculations. The truth was hidden inside the corroded bronze. A mechanical mystery. After waiting 2,000 years on the seabed, awaiting the advancement of science and technology to be solved. The Antikythera mechanism was introduced to the world, but nobody knew what it was. They only knew one thing. This was something important, and solving this mystery, whatever the cost, had to be done.
November 24, 1900. The Greek Royal Navy corvette Mycale dropped anchor in the choppy waters off Antikythera's northern coast. Captain Dimitrios Kondos stood on deck with his crew of experienced sponge divers, looking down at the water that concealed what would become one of history's most significant archaeological sites. Behind them, archaeologists bitted on Stace supervised the loading of salvage equipment, winches, rope systems, baskets for raising artifacts, and the primitive air pumps that would keep divers alive at depth. The operation was unprecedented. No one had ever attempted systematic underwater archaeology before. The concept didn't exist. Kondos and his divers would essentially invent the field as they went, learning through trial and error what worked and what didn't. The archaeologists on board were experienced with land excavations, but had no framework for underwater work. They would have to adapt quickly. The first challenge was establishing a working system. At 60 meters depth, divers couldn't stay down long. The pressure was crushing, nearly 7 atmospheres, 7 times the pressure at sea level. Under these conditions, nitrogen from the air dissolves into the bloodstream. Ascend too quickly, and that nitrogen forms bubbles in the blood and tissues, decompression sickness, also called the bends. The condition ranged from painful to paralyzing to fatal. There were no decompression tables in 1900, no scientific understanding of how to dive safely at this depth. The divers worked on instinct and experience. Kondos established a rotation system. 6 divers would work in shifts. Each diver would descend, work for approximately 5 minutes, then ascend slowly. After surfacing, that diver wouldn't dive again for several hours, allowing his body to off-gas the accumulated nitrogen. It was frustratingly slow, only about 30 minutes of actual bottom time per day across all divers, but it was the safest approach they could devise. The descent itself was harrowing. A diver would don his heavy canvas suit, brass helmet, and weighted boots. An assistant would connect the air hose from the surface pump to the helmet. The diver would signal readiness, then step off the boat into the Aegean. He'd sink rapidly, the weight of his equipment pulling him down through increasingly dark and cold water. The only illumination came from above, diffused sunlight that grew dimmer with each meter of descent. At 60 meters, the world was twilight blue. The water temperature was about 15 degrees Celsius, cold enough to numb exposed skin quickly. Visibility varied with conditions, but averaged about 10 to 15 meters.
The diver would land on the rocky seabed, his weighted boots crunching on ancient debris. Around him, scattered across the rocks and partially buried in sediment, was the wreckage of a ship that had died 2,000 years ago. The ship itself was mostly gone. Wood doesn't survive 2 millennia underwater unless conditions are exceptional, and the Antikythera site wasn't exceptional in that regard. What remained was the cargo and any metal or stone objects the ship had carried. Bronze and marble survived well. Ceramics survived if they weren't broken by the impact of the sinking or subsequent movement. But the ship's hull, masts, rigging, and most organic materials had been consumed by marine organisms centuries ago. What the divers found was a debris field approximately 50 meters long and 30 meters wide, stretching along a rocky slope. Objects were scattered, some partially buried, others fully exposed. Large bronze statues lay among the rocks like sleeping giants. Marble sculptures, some intact, others fragmented, were embedded in the seabed. Amphora, ceramic storage jars, clustered in groups, suggesting they'd been stored together in the ship's hold, and everywhere smaller objects, bronze furniture pieces, glass vessels, coins, jewelry. The salvage process was crude but effective. A diver would identify an object suitable for recovery, usually something not too large or too firmly embedded. He'd tie a rope around it, securing it as best he could. Then he'd signal the surface crew by tugging the rope in a specific pattern. The crew would haul the object up slowly, careful not to break fragile ceramics or lose smaller items. When the object reached the surface, it would be carefully brought aboard and placed in seawater tanks to prevent rapid drying, which could crack or crumble ancient materials. The first major recovery was a bronze statue, a nude male figure, life-sized, beautifully preserved despite 2,000 years underwater. The statue's bronze had developed a green patina but was structurally intact. When it was brought to the surface on November 27, 1900, everyone on board recognized they were handling something extraordinary. This wasn't just an artifact, it was a masterpiece of classical sculpture, created by a skilled artisan in an age when Rome was still a republic and Julius Caesar wasn't yet born. Over the following days, more statues emerged from the depths. A bronze statue of a young man with one arm raised, as if addressing an audience, later identified as possibly representing Paris from the Judgment of Paris myth, though the identification remains debated. Marble statues of philosophers, their features still discernible despite damage. A bronze lyre, a musical instrument, decorated with elaborate details. A bronze statue of a horse's head and front legs, clearly part of a larger equestrian composition that had broken apart. But the work was dangerous beyond the risk of decompression sickness. The site itself was hazardous. Sharp rocks could tear a diver's suit, causing rapid loss of air and potential drowning. Strong currents periodically swept the area, threatening to push divers off the site or tangle their air hoses. And the psychological stress was immense. Working in near darkness, in crushing pressure, breathing air that hissed through a long rubber tube from a pump operated by someone you couldn't see or communicate with directly, it required extraordinary mental discipline. On December 3, 1900, the operation suffered its first casualty. A diver named Georgos descended for what should have been a routine dive. He spent about 4 minutes on the bottom, secured a rope around a large amphora, and signaled for ascent. But something went wrong during his ascent. He rose too quickly, perhaps panicked by something on the bottom, perhaps pulled up too fast by the surface crew. When he reached the surface and his helmet was removed, he was unconscious.
The crew tried to revive him. They'd seen decompression sickness before. It was an occupational hazard for sponge divers. Usually, victims experienced joint pain, difficulty breathing, or neurological symptoms. Sometimes these symptoms resolved on their own. Sometimes they didn't. Yorgos never regained consciousness. When he finally woke hours later, he couldn't move his legs. The nitrogen bubbles had formed in his spinal cord, causing paralysis. He would never walk again. The accident cast a pall over the operation. Captain Kondos met with Spiridon Stace and the naval officers supervising the work. Should they continue? One man had been crippled for life. How many more casualties were acceptable? The divers themselves were shaken, but willing to continue. This was their profession. They understood the risks. They'd known men who'd been paralyzed or killed by diving accidents. It was tragic, but not unexpected. The decision was made to continue, but with increased safety measures. Ascent rates would be controlled more carefully. Divers would limit bottom time to 4 minutes instead of 5, and weather conditions would be monitored more strictly. No diving if seas were rough or visibility was poor. The work resumed on December 5th. For the next 6 weeks, the operation continued with remarkable success, despite the dangers. The crew established an efficient routine. Divers would descend, work efficiently, attach ropes to artifacts, and ascend. The surface crew would raise objects, document them with Stace supervising, and store them safely. By mid-January 1901, the collection had grown to include dozens of major pieces and hundreds of smaller artifacts. Among the recovered items were objects that provided clues about the ship itself. Amphorae with merchant marks suggested the ship had been involved in trade. Some amphorae still contained residues of wine or oil, preserved by their sealed interiors. Coins found among the wreckage helped date the sinking. Most were Roman coins from the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BC. The latest coins dated to around 70–60 BC, suggesting the ship sank sometime after that date, probably in the middle of the 1st century BC. The ship's cargo indicated it was carrying luxury goods to Rome or another major Roman center. The statues alone represented enormous wealth. Bronze statues in particular were incredibly valuable in the ancient world. Bronze was expensive, and casting large statues required exceptional skill. The presence of multiple bronze statues suggested the ship was transporting plundered Greek art, perhaps taken from conquered Greek cities and being shipped to wealthy Roman collectors. This was common in the 1st century BC as Rome expanded its empire and Roman elites developed a taste for Greek culture and art. But not all objects were large or obviously valuable. Among the wreckage were fragments that seemed insignificant, pieces of corroded bronze, ceramic shards, wooden remains. One particular object, recovered in early 1901, appeared to be nothing more than a corroded lump of bronze about the size of a shoebox. It was heavily encrusted with marine growth and concretion, the limestone-like material that forms on metal objects underwater. The divers brought it up because it seemed to be worked metal rather than natural rock, but nobody thought it was particularly important. It was cataloged, placed in storage with other miscellaneous bronze fragments, and essentially forgotten. In late January 1901, weather conditions deteriorated. Winter storms made diving impossible. The Aegean in winter is notoriously rough, with winds and waves that make even surface navigation dangerous. The decision was made to suspend operations until conditions improved. But as weeks passed and weather remained poor, it became clear the season was over. The operation would have to wait until the following year to resume. Except it never did resume. In February 1901, another tragedy struck. A diver named Hopsus descended for what would be the final dive of the operation. He spent 3 minutes on the bottom, attached no ropes, and signaled for ascent. When he reached the surface, he was conscious but complaining of severe joint pain and difficulty breathing. Within hours, he was dead. Decompression sickness had killed him. This second fatality ended the Antikythera salvage operation. Captain Kondos and his crew had suffered 2 casualties, one paralyzed and one dead. The divers were unwilling to continue. The families of the victims were demanding compensation, and frankly, the operation had already recovered an enormous collection. Continuing seemed to offer diminishing returns at increasing risk. The final inventory was impressive: 36 marble sculptures or fragments, 23 bronze sculptures or major bronze objects, numerous pieces of bronze furniture, dozens of amphorae, glass vessels, jewelry, coins, and hundreds of smaller artifacts. Additionally, there were various unidentified bronze fragments, including that corroded lump that nobody had yet examined closely. The collection was transported to Athens and delivered to the National Archaeological Museum in March 1901. Curators and archaeologists began the long process of conservation, documentation, and study. Each object was cleaned, cataloged, and analyzed. The major statues were put on display and became immediate sensations. The public flocked to see these treasures recovered from the sea, tangible connections to ancient Greece and Rome. But amid the celebrations and scholarly excitement, one object remained largely ignored. That corroded bronze lump sat in a storage room, waiting for someone to look closely enough to notice what was hidden inside, waiting for someone to ask the right questions, waiting to reveal a secret that would change our understanding of ancient technology forever.
May 17th, 1902. In a conservation laboratory of the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, an unnamed technician was cleaning artifacts from the Antikythera Shipwreck. The work was tedious, carefully removing marine concretion from bronze objects, documenting each piece, preparing them for cataloging. Among the items on his workbench was that corroded bronze lump, the one that had seemed so insignificant when divers brought it up over a year ago. It had been sitting in storage, low priority, just another piece of unidentified wreckage. The technician was cleaning the surface when a piece of the concretion broke away. Underneath, instead of solid bronze, he saw something unexpected. A gap, a space between metal plates, and inside that space, something that looked like a wheel? No, a gear. A bronze gear with teeth, clearly manufactured, clearly part of some mechanism. The technician stopped, examined more closely, and realized what he was looking at was completely outside his experience. This wasn't a statue fragment or decorative object. This was a machine. He immediately reported his finding to museum director Valerio Stais. Stais examined the object and recognized its significance instantly. Ancient Greece wasn't supposed to have complex geared mechanisms. The historical understanding was clear. The Greeks were brilliant philosophers, mathematicians, sculptors, and architects, but their mechanical technology was relatively primitive. They had simple levers, pulleys, screws, and basic tools. But geared mechanisms, complex machinery, that was centuries, even millennia in the future. Yet here was physical evidence contradicting that understanding. Stais could see not just one gear, but multiple gears, positioned at different orientations, clearly designed to work together. And there was more. On the metal surfaces, barely visible through the corrosion, were inscriptions, Greek letters, ancient Greek text engraved directly onto the mechanism's components. This wasn't medieval. This wasn't a hoax. This was genuinely ancient, recovered from a shipwreck that dated to approximately 65 BC based on other artifacts. A 2,000-year-old machine. Stais published a preliminary report in 1902, describing the object and suggesting it might be an astronomical calculating device. The response from the international scholarly community was skepticism. Not hostile exactly, but deeply doubtful.
Most experts simply couldn't accept that ancient Greeks possessed the mechanical sophistication to build something like this. The object must be misidentified, they argued. Perhaps it was a later intrusion, somehow mixed with the ancient artifacts. Perhaps it was from a different wreck, accidentally recovered at the same site. Perhaps the dating was wrong. But Stice was certain. The object had been found with other artifacts from the same wreck. The marine concretion that covered it was consistent with 2,000 years of underwater exposure. The Greek inscriptions were in a script that dated to the 1st century BC. Everything about the object confirmed it was contemporary with the shipwreck. The question wasn't whether it was ancient. The question was what it did and how the ancient Greeks built it. The problem was the object itself. It was in terrible condition. The bronze had corroded extensively, the corrosion products binding the components together into a solid mass. Any attempt to clean or separate the parts risked destroying them. The technology for non-destructive examination didn't exist in 1902. X-rays had been discovered only 7 years earlier and weren't yet sophisticated enough for archaeological applications. Scholars could only study what was visible on the surface, which wasn't much. One German philologist, Albert Reim, became fascinated with the mechanism in the 1900s and made careful studies of the visible inscriptions. Reim was an expert in ancient astronomy and mathematics. He recognized that the Greek text wasn't random. It was technical terminology related to astronomical observations and calculations. Words like zodiac, eclipse, and references to celestial bodies appeared in the fragments of text he could read. This suggested the mechanism was indeed related to astronomy. Reim proposed that the device was a mechanical planetarium or an astronomical calculator of some kind. Based on the visible gear arrangements and the inscriptions, he theorized it could calculate the positions of celestial bodies, the sun, moon, and possibly planets. This was an extraordinary claim. Such a device would demonstrate mathematical and mechanical sophistication that historians didn't think existed until at least 1,000 years later, with the development of Islamic and European mechanical clocks in the medieval period. But Reim couldn't prove his theory. The mechanism was too corroded, too fragmented. What was visible suggested complexity, but the full extent of that complexity remained hidden inside the corroded mass. Reim's work was published in limited academic venues and largely ignored by the broader scholarly community. The Antikythera mechanism remained a curiosity, occasionally mentioned in archaeological literature, but not seriously studied. Part of the problem was preservation. The object was fragile. Shortly after its discovery, it had begun to fragment as the bronze corroded and dried. By 1910, the main mass had split into multiple pieces, eventually totaling 82 separate fragments, ranging from substantial chunks to tiny pieces barely a centimeter across. Museum staff tried to preserve the fragments, but conservation techniques of the era were primitive. The object was slowly deteriorating. The fragments were stored carefully, but without understanding what the mechanism did, scholars couldn't make sense of the pieces. It was like having parts of a complex puzzle, but no picture to guide reassembly. Some fragments clearly showed gears, others showed inscribed metal plates with Greek text. But how did they fit together? What was the original configuration? And most importantly, what was the device designed to calculate?
A few researchers continued studying the mechanism sporadically over the following decades. In 1951, British science historian Derek J. DeSola Price became interested in the object after seeing it mentioned in an archaeological reference. Price was a physicist and historian of science with a particular interest in ancient scientific instruments.
He recognized that the Antikythera mechanism represented something potentially revolutionary for understanding ancient technology. Price began corresponding with the National Archaeological Museum, requesting detailed photographs and information about the mechanism. What he received back frustrated him. The photographs were poor quality, the descriptions vague. He realized he needed to examine the object personally. In 1958, Price finally traveled to Athens to study the mechanism firsthand. What Price saw both excited and challenged him. The fragments were in worse condition than he'd hoped. Corrosion was severe. The Greek inscriptions were barely legible in most places. But Price had an advantage that earlier researchers lacked. He was a physicist and historian of science, with a particular interest in ancient scientific instruments. He recognized that the Antikythera mechanism represented something potentially revolutionary for understanding ancient technology. Price began corresponding with the National Archaeological Museum, requesting detailed photographs and information about the mechanism. What he received back frustrated him. The photographs were poor quality, the descriptions vague. He realized he needed to examine the object personally. In 1958, Price finally traveled to Athens to study the mechanism firsthand. What Price saw both excited and challenged him. The fragments were in worse condition than he'd hoped. Corrosion was severe. The Greek inscriptions were barely legible in most places. But Price had an advantage that earlier researchers lacked. He was a physicist and understood mechanical engineering. Looking at the visible gears, he could deduce how they likely meshed together, what ratios they might represent, and what calculations they could perform. He spent weeks examining every visible detail. He measured gear teeth, counted the number of teeth on each visible wheel, documented the inscriptions he could read, and sketched the spatial relationships between fragments. He was building a mental model of the device, trying to reconstruct its original form and function from fragmentary evidence. His preliminary conclusion was startling. This was a mechanical analog computer, not metaphorically, literally. The mechanism used bronze gears to perform mathematical calculations related to astronomical phenomena. Input would be provided by turning a handle or dial. That rotation would drive a complex series of gears. The gears were sized and arranged to represent mathematical relationships between astronomical cycles: the solar year, the lunar month, the metonic cycle, the 19-year period after which lunar phases repeat on the same dates, and possibly others. Output would be displayed on dials showing the calculated positions of the sun and moon, dates of eclipses, and other astronomical information. If Price was correct, this device represented computational sophistication that the ancient world supposedly didn't possess. It implied knowledge of gear ratios, mechanical engineering, and mathematical astronomy far beyond what historians had attributed to ancient Greece. It would mean that someone, somewhere around 100 or 150 BC, had designed and built what amounted to the world's first known analog computer, nearly 2,000 years before Charles Babbage conceived his difference engine. But Price couldn't prove it, not yet. His analysis was based on surface examination and mechanical logic, but he couldn't see inside the corroded fragments. He couldn't confirm his gear ratio calculations without knowing exactly how many teeth each gear had. He couldn't read most of the inscriptions, which likely contained crucial information about the device's function. He needed technology that could see inside the bronze without physically disassembling the fragile fragments. That technology existed: X-ray imaging. But conventional X-rays of the 1950s weren't sophisticated enough for this application. The mechanism's fragments were too thick, too corroded, and the internal structures too complex. X-rays would show something, but not with enough clarity to understand the mechanism's full complexity. Price needed better imaging technology. He would have to wait. But Price was patient and determined. He published preliminary papers about the mechanism in the 1950s and 1960s, building academic interest. He argued that the device deserved serious study, that it represented a lost tradition of ancient mechanical engineering that had been forgotten and had to be reinvented centuries later. His papers were controversial but compelling. Slowly, the scholarly community began to pay attention to the Antikythera mechanism. The mechanism itself sat in the National Archaeological Museum, fragmented and corroded, containing secrets that 50 years of study hadn't revealed. The visible gears hinted at complexity. The Greek inscriptions suggested sophisticated astronomical knowledge. But the full truth remained locked inside the bronze, waiting for technology to catch up with the ancient craftsman's skill. And in the meantime, questions multiplied. Who built this device? Where was it made? What specific calculations did it perform? Was this a unique object, or did similar mechanisms exist in the ancient world? If they existed, where were they? Why had this tradition of mechanical astronomy been lost? And perhaps most intriguingly, if ancient Greeks could build something this sophisticated, what else had they created that didn't survive? The Antikythera mechanism had transformed from a corroded curiosity into one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. It stood as a challenge to historical assumptions about ancient technology, suggesting that the past was far more advanced than the present believed. Somewhere in that corroded bronze was knowledge that had been lost for 2 millennia. Knowledge that, when finally recovered, would force historians to rewrite their understanding of ancient science and engineering. The mechanism waited, patient as it had been patient on the seabed for 2,000 years, patient as it had been patient in museum storage for 50 more. The secrets were there, encoded in bronze gears and Greek inscriptions. Someone just had to find the right way to read them.
The period between 1902 and 1950 was largely silent for the Antikythera mechanism. The corroded bronze fragments sat in storage at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, occasionally examined by curious scholars, but never systematically studied. World War I and World War II disrupted academic research across Europe. Greece itself suffered occupation, civil conflict, and political instability that left little resources for archaeological study of ancient mechanical devices. The mechanism remained a footnote in archaeological literature, mentioned occasionally, understood by virtually no one. But a few researchers refused to forget it. Albert Rehm, the German philologist who'd studied the inscriptions in the 1900s and 1910s, continued working on the problem sporadically until his death in 1949. His notes, unpublished during his lifetime, contained remarkably prescient observations. Rehm had concluded that the mechanism was designed to calculate not just the positions of the sun and moon, but also the timing of eclipses, and possibly the positions of planets. This was an extraordinary claim for its time, suggesting ancient Greeks possessed astronomical knowledge and mechanical ability that conventional history denied them. Rehm's work was largely forgotten until decades later, when his notes were rediscovered in archives. But in his time, he was essentially working alone, without access to the mechanism itself after World War I made travel between Germany and Greece difficult. He relied on photographs, sketches, and his own earlier notes. The mechanism's secrets remained locked behind corrosion and distance. Another early researcher, Admiral John Theophanidis of the Hellenic Navy, studied the mechanism in the 1920s and 1930s. Theophanidis had a practical military officer's perspective combined with interest in ancient maritime history. He recognized that a device capable of calculating astronomical positions would have been invaluable for ancient navigation. The sun's position determined latitude. The moon's position could help estimate longitude through lunar distance measurements. If the mechanism could predict these positions accurately, it would have been a navigation tool of immense value. Theophanidis' theory was intriguing but problematic. Navigation in the ancient world didn't rely on precise astronomical calculations. Sailors used simpler methods like coastal landmarks, prevailing winds, and basic star observations. A complex mechanical calculator seemed like overkill for navigation. But Theophanidis' work did highlight an important question. Who would use such a device? Astronomers, certainly, but who else? And why make it portable, as the mechanism was clearly designed to be? The answer to who would use this was tied to understanding what exactly the device calculated, and that understanding required seeing inside the corroded bronze. The technology to do that non-destructively didn't exist in the 1920s and 30s. X-ray imaging was advancing, but slowly. Medical X-rays could image bones through flesh, but imaging complex metal objects through corrosion required much more sophisticated equipment and techniques. World War II brought technological advances: radar, sonar, improved electronics, and better imaging systems. After the war, these technologies gradually became available for civilian applications, including archaeology. But Greece had been devastated by occupation and civil war. The National Archaeological Museum had barely survived. Artifacts had been hidden or evacuated, buildings damaged, staff scattered. Resuming research on something as esoteric as the Antikythera mechanism wasn't a priority when the nation was rebuilding. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, a new generation of scholars began discovering the mechanism. These were younger researchers, trained in the post-war era, who were less constrained by traditional assumptions about ancient technology. They'd grown up with radar, computers — the first electronic computers appeared in the 1940s — and sophisticated mechanical devices. The idea that ancient Greeks might have built complex mechanical calculators seemed less impossible to them than to earlier generations. One of these new researchers was Derek John de Solla Price, a young British physicist and historian of science. Price had trained in physics and mathematics at the University of London and became interested in the history of scientific instruments. In 1951, while researching medieval astronomical instruments, Price came across a reference to the Antikythera mechanism in an archaeological journal. The brief description intrigued him: an ancient geared device, possibly astronomical, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck. This sounded exactly like the kind of historical mystery Price loved. Price began collecting everything he could find about the mechanism. There wasn't much. A few papers from the early 1900s, Rem's published work, though not his unpublished notes, which Price didn't know existed yet, some photographs from the museum. The information was fragmentary and often contradictory, but Price was convinced this object was important. Something about it suggested lost knowledge, advanced technology that history had forgotten. In 1958, Price finally managed to arrange a visit to Athens to examine the mechanism personally. What he saw both thrilled and frustrated him. The fragments were in worse condition than he'd hoped, but they were also more complex than he'd imagined. Price counted at least 30 separate gear wheels visible in the fragments, many showing clear evidence of careful manufacturing. The gear teeth were evenly spaced, precisely cut, clearly the work of a skilled craftsman using sophisticated tools. Price spent 2 weeks in Athens, measuring, photographing, and sketching everything he could see. He brought measuring calipers to count gear teeth precisely. He used magnifying glasses to examine inscriptions. He made detailed drawings of how the fragments might fit together. His goal was to create a complete reconstruction of the device, to understand not just what it looked like, but how it worked. The challenge was enormous. The 82 fragments were like puzzle pieces from multiple puzzles mixed together. Some fragments clearly fit together, their break patterns matching, but others were ambiguous. And the severe corrosion meant that even fragments that originally connected might not have matching break patterns anymore. Corrosion could have destroyed the evidence of their connection.
Price focused on what he could determine with certainty. He identified the main gear train, the primary sequence of gears that transferred motion from the input, a handle the user would turn, to various outputs, dials showing calculated results. He counted teeth on the visible gears and calculated the ratios between them. These ratios were crucial because they represented the mathematical relationships the mechanism was designed to compute. One ratio stood out immediately: 254:19. This ratio appeared in multiple gear pairs, clearly intentional. Price recognized it instantly. It's an excellent approximation of the metonic cycle. The Metonic cycle, discovered by Greek astronomer Meton in 432 BC, states that 254 sidereal months, the time for the moon to return to the same position relative to the stars, equal 19 solar years, almost exactly. This cycle was fundamental to ancient Greek astronomy and was used to synchronize lunar and solar calendars. The presence of this ratio in the gears meant the mechanism could convert between lunar and solar calendars. It could show the relationship between the moon's phases and the solar year. This was sophisticated astronomy, requiring precise mathematical knowledge and mechanical implementation. Ancient Greeks knew this astronomy theoretically. It appeared in astronomical texts, but Price was seeing physical evidence that they'd implemented it mechanically. Other gear ratios hinted at additional calculations. Some seemed related to the sun's motion through the zodiac. Others might represent the moon's varying speed. The moon doesn't move at a constant rate because its orbit is elliptical, a fact that ancient Greeks knew and incorporated into their astronomical models. If the mechanism accounted for the moon's variable speed, it was even more sophisticated than a simple calendar calculator. But Price couldn't confirm his theories without seeing more. Most of the mechanism's interior was hidden by corrosion. The inscriptions, which likely explained the device's purpose and operation, were mostly illegible. Price needed better imaging technology. He needed X-rays, but not just any X-rays. He needed high-quality radiography that could penetrate the corroded bronze and reveal the internal structure with sufficient clarity to count gear teeth, measure ratios, and read inscribed text. In 1958, such technology existed, but was expensive and not readily available for archaeological research. Price would need to convince the Greek government and the National Archaeological Museum that investing in advanced imaging was worthwhile. He'd need to demonstrate that the mechanism was important enough to justify the expense. And he'd need to find someone with the right equipment and expertise willing to collaborate on the project. Price spent the following years building his case. He published papers in academic journals describing what he'd observed and theorizing about the mechanism's capabilities. He gave lectures at universities, showing photographs and drawings, arguing that the Antikythera mechanism represented a lost tradition of ancient mechanical engineering. He cultivated relationships with Greek officials and museum administrators, gradually convincing them that this corroded lump of bronze was worth serious scientific attention. His efforts were aided by growing interest in ancient technology. The 1950s and 1960s saw increased appreciation for ancient engineering achievements. Scholars were documenting sophisticated concrete, understanding the precision of Egyptian stone cutting, and recognizing that ancient civilizations were more technologically advanced than previously assumed. The Antikythera mechanism fit this pattern. It showed ancient Greeks as engineers and instrument makers, not just philosophers and sculptors. By the early 1960s, Price had secured cooperation from the Greek government for an advanced imaging study. But finding the right collaborators took more years. The equipment needed was specialized: high-powered X-ray machines, precise positioning systems, and photographic equipment capable of capturing the X-ray images with sufficient detail to count gear teeth, measure ratios, and read inscribed text. Medical X-ray equipment wasn't suitable. Industrial X-ray systems designed for examining metal components and manufacturing were what was needed. Finally, in 1971, Price found his partner, Charalambos Karakalis, a Greek radiologist with access to advanced X-ray equipment at the Greek Atomic Energy Commission. Karakalis was intrigued by the challenge of imaging the mechanism. His equipment was designed for examining nuclear reactor components and could produce high-energy X-rays capable of penetrating the corroded bronze. The collaboration between Price and Karakalis would finally allow researchers to see inside the mechanism. But before that collaboration could produce results, Price needed to do more preparatory work. He needed to create detailed reference materials documenting the mechanism's current state. He needed to prepare the museum staff for the imaging process. And he needed to publish his preliminary findings, establishing the scholarly foundation for what would be a revolutionary discovery. In 1974, after years of preparation, Price published Gears from the Greeks, a comprehensive paper in the journal Science presenting his theories about the mechanism. The paper was bold and controversial. Price claimed the device was the world's first computer, a mechanical analog computer designed to calculate astronomical phenomena. He presented his gear ratio calculations, his reconstruction drawings, and his interpretation of the visible inscriptions. The paper concluded that ancient Greeks possessed mechanical technology and astronomical knowledge far beyond what history books acknowledged. The response was mixed. Some scholars embraced Price's work, recognizing it as groundbreaking. Others remained skeptical, arguing that Price was overinterpreting limited evidence, that his reconstructions were too speculative, that he was making extraordinary claims based on fragmentary data. The debate was vigorous, but ultimately productive. It brought attention to the mechanism and encouraged other researchers to study it. Price had transformed the Antikythera mechanism from an obscure curiosity into a major archaeological mystery. His decades of research had established it as potentially the most important technological artifact from the ancient world. But the full truth still remained hidden inside the corroded bronze, waiting for X-rays to reveal what 2 millennia and 70 years of scholarship couldn't expose. The breakthrough was coming, but it would reveal complexity that even Price, with all his insight and imagination, hadn't fully anticipated.
1971. Charalambos Karakalos wheeled his industrial X-ray equipment into the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The Greek radiologist had agreed to collaborate with Derek Price on what they both hoped would be the definitive examination of the Antikythera mechanism. For the first time, technology sophisticated enough to see through the corrosion and reveal the mechanism's internal structure was being applied to this ancient puzzle. The equipment Karakalos brought was far more powerful than medical X-ray machines. It generated high-energy radiation capable of penetrating thick metal, the type used to examine welds in nuclear reactors and inspect aircraft components for hidden flaws. The challenge would be positioning the fragments precisely, adjusting the X-ray beam for optimal exposure, and capturing images with enough detail to count individual gear teeth and read corroded inscriptions. Price and Karakalos worked systematically through the 82 fragments, radiographing each piece from multiple angles. The process was painstaking. Each fragment had to be positioned carefully, often requiring custom supports to hold it at the correct angle. The X-ray exposure had to be calibrated. Too weak, and the internal structure wouldn't show through the corrosion. Too strong, and the image would be overexposed, losing detail. Photographic plates captured the X-ray images, which then had to be developed and examined. The results were revelatory. For the first time, researchers could see gears that were completely hidden by corrosion, invisible to the naked eye. Price could now count teeth on wheels he'd only guessed existed. He could trace gear trains through the mechanism's interior, understanding how motion transferred from one wheel to another. And most excitingly, he could read inscriptions on internal surfaces that had been invisible since the mechanism corroded centuries ago. What the X-rays revealed was staggering complexity. Price had theorized the mechanism contained perhaps 30 to 40 gears.
The X-rays showed there were more. At least 30 surviving gears, but clear evidence that additional gears had been lost when the mechanism fragmented. The original device probably contained 35 to 40 gears in total. These weren't simple gears either. They were precisely manufactured, with evenly spaced teeth, showing clear evidence of sophisticated metalworking tools, probably a primitive form of gear-cutting lathe. The gear arrangement was ingenious. At the center was a large driving wheel turned by a hand crank. This wheel drove multiple gear trains simultaneously, each calculating different astronomical phenomena. One train calculated the sun's position through the zodiac. Another calculated the moon's position and phase. Additional trains computed the positions of the 5 planets known to the ancient Greeks: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. But the most sophisticated element was the moon mechanism. Ancient Greek astronomers knew the moon's speed varied as it orbited Earth, moving faster at perigee, closest approach, and slower at apogee, farthest point. This variation follows a complex pattern called lunar anomaly. Modeling it mechanically was extremely difficult. Yet the X-rays revealed that the Antikythera mechanism included a special gear system to replicate lunar anomaly, a pin and slot device that caused one gear to drive another with variable speed, precisely matching the moon's observed motion. Price was astounded. This pin and slot mechanism anticipated similar devices developed in medieval Islamic astronomy by about 1300 years and European clockwork by about 1500 years. The ancient Greek craftsmen who built this device understood both the astronomy and the mechanical engineering necessary to implement it. This wasn't primitive technology stumbled upon by accident. This was sophisticated engineering by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. The inscriptions the X-rays revealed were equally important. Previous researchers had only been able to read fragments of text on the mechanism's exterior surfaces. The X-rays exposed text on interior surfaces, protected from weathering by the corrosion that sealed them. Caracullus's X-rays weren't sharp enough to read all the inscribed letters clearly, but they showed that extensive text existed, far more than anyone had suspected. Price spent months analyzing the X-ray images. He created detailed technical drawings showing the gear arrangements. He calculated the ratios between every visible gear pair. He attempted to read the inscriptions, though the X-ray image quality made this difficult. By 1974, he was ready to publish his findings. His paper, Gears from the Greeks, the Antikythera Mechanism, a calendar computer from K80 BC, appeared in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society in 1974. It was comprehensive and revolutionary. Price presented a complete reconstruction of the mechanism, showing how each gear connected, what calculations each gear train performed, and how the device would have been used. His reconstruction showed a bronze box about the size of a shoebox, with gears inside and dials on the front and back. The user would turn a crank, and the dials would show the calculated positions of the sun, moon, and planets, along with calendar information and eclipse predictions. Price's most dramatic claim was historical. He argued that the Antikythera mechanism represented a sophisticated tradition of ancient mechanical astronomy that had been completely lost to history. This wasn't a unique genius invention. The level of sophistication suggested a developed tradition, probably originating in the 3rd or 2nd century BC and continuing for some time. The mechanism found in the shipwreck was likely made around 150 to 100 BC based on astronomical parameters encoded in its gears and the shipwreck's dating.
The shipwreck was found near Antikythera, on a likely route from Rhodes to Rome. The cargo of Greek art being shipped to Roman collectors fit the historical context. Wealthy Romans in the 1st century BC were avid consumers of Greek culture, including scientific instruments. The mechanism might have been commissioned by a Roman patron, or could have been part of a scholar's personal equipment being transported to Rome. But if this tradition existed, if ancient Greeks were building complex mechanical calculators routinely, why didn't any others survive? Why was this the only known example? Price had theories. Bronze was valuable and regularly recycled in the ancient world. A broken mechanical device would be melted down, the metal reused. The Antikythera mechanism only survived because it sank in a shipwreck and was sealed in protective corrosion before anyone could salvage it. Hundreds of similar devices might have existed, all melted down centuries ago, their existence mentioned in ancient texts that scholars had misunderstood or dismissed as metaphorical. Price pointed to ancient references that suddenly made sense in light of the mechanism. Cicero, the Roman orator, mentioned in his writings that the Greek astronomer Posidonius, 135 to 51 BC, had built a device that reproduced the motions of the sun, moon, and planets. Historians had assumed this was a decorative orrery or a simple model, but perhaps it was something like the Antikythera mechanism, a working calculator that actually predicted astronomical positions. Similarly, Archimedes, 287 to 212 BC, was said to have built a planetarium. Again, historians assumed this was metaphorical or referred to a static model. Perhaps Archimedes built something mechanical and functional. Price's work was immediately controversial. Many classical scholars rejected his conclusions. They argued the reconstruction was too speculative, that Price was interpreting ambiguous evidence to fit his theories, that the ancient Greeks simply didn't have this level of technology. The debate became heated, with some scholars defending Price and others attacking his methodology and conclusions. But Price had one enormous advantage. The X-ray images were publicly available. Other researchers could examine them, check his gear counts, verify his ratio calculations. And increasingly, as more scholars studied the images, they confirmed Price's basic findings. The gears were there. The ratios were correct. The mechanism really was as complex as Price claimed. Derek Price died in 1983, just 9 years after publishing his landmark paper. He didn't live to see later research that would vindicate many of his theories and reveal even greater complexity than he'd discovered. But his work had fundamentally changed understanding of the Antikythera mechanism. He transformed it from a mystery to an understood, if still remarkable, artifact. He'd proven that ancient Greeks possessed mechanical sophistication that history had forgotten. Yet even with Price's breakthrough, mysteries remained. The inscriptions were still mostly unread. The X-ray images weren't clear enough for complete transcription. The exact functions of some gear trains remained uncertain, and the question of who built it, where, and for what purpose was still debated. Price had opened the door, but the room beyond contained more secrets. In the years after Price's death, interest in the mechanism didn't diminish, it intensified. New researchers using Price's work as foundation began developing their own theories. Some disagreed with aspects of Price's reconstruction. Others proposed additional functions he hadn't identified. The mechanism became a test case for understanding ancient technology, with implications far beyond a single artifact. One significant development came in the 1990s with advances in computer-aided design. researchers began creating 3D digital models of the mechanism based on Price's drawings and the X-ray images. These models allowed them to test whether proposed gear arrangements actually worked mechanically, whether the ratios achieved the claimed calculations, whether the whole system could function as a unified device. Increasingly, these simulations confirmed that Price had been essentially correct about the mechanism's basic operation. But the 1990s also brought a realization. Price's X-rays, revolutionary as they were in 1971, weren't good enough. The images had limitations. Some gears were visible only partially. Some inscriptions were too corroded to read even with X-rays. And the three-dimensional structure of the mechanism, how components were arranged in depth, was difficult to reconstruct from two-dimensional X-ray images.
October 2005. A specialized X-ray computed tomography scanner, custom-built by the company X-Tech Systems, was carefully transported into the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The machine weighed over 8 tons and had been designed specifically for this project to image the Antikythera mechanism fragments with resolution and detail impossible with conventional equipment. The machine could produce three-dimensional images showing internal structure down to details as small as 50 microns, about half the width of a human hair. Leading the new research effort was Tony Freeth, a British mathematician and filmmaker who'd become obsessed with the mechanism after reading Derek Price's work. Freeth had assembled an international team called the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, including Mike Edmonds, astronomer from Cardiff University, John Siridakis, astronomer from Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and several Greek researchers from the National Archaeological Museum. Their goal was ambitious: completely decode the mechanism's functions and read all surviving inscriptions. The CT scanning process took weeks. Each of the 82 fragments had to be positioned precisely inside the scanner. The machine would rotate around the fragment, taking thousands of X-ray images from different angles. Computer algorithms would then process these images, constructing a complete three-dimensional model of the fragment's internal structure. The resulting data files were enormous, gigabytes per fragment, but contained information that no previous examination had captured. When the first reconstructed 3D images appeared on computer screens, the team realized they were seeing details that Price never could have imagined. Individual gear teeth were visible with crystal clarity. Inscriptions appeared sharp and readable, even on surfaces buried deep inside corroded bronze. The three-dimensional nature of the data meant they could digitally dissect the mechanism, examining how components fit together without physically touching the fragile fragments. The gear systems proved even more complex than Price had documented. The CT scans revealed gears that X-rays had missed, hidden behind other components or too corroded for Price's imaging to detect. The team identified at least 37 gears in the surviving fragments, with clear evidence that the original mechanism had contained 40 or more. Each gear was precisely manufactured. The teeth were evenly spaced, the hubs carefully centered, the overall construction showing extraordinary craftsmanship. But the most significant discovery came from the inscriptions. Price had identified that extensive Greek text covered the mechanism's surfaces, but he'd only been able to read fragments. The CT scans revealed approximately 3,500 characters of text, far more than anyone had expected. This wasn't just labeling, it was an instruction manual. The ancient Greeks who built this device had included comprehensive documentation explaining what it calculated and how to use it. Translating these inscriptions became a major effort. The text was in Koine Greek, the common dialect of the Hellenistic period, but used specialized astronomical and mechanical terminology. Some words were damaged or ambiguous. But gradually, as philologists worked through the text, a coherent picture emerged. The inscriptions describe the mechanism as a calculating device for astronomy and calendar purposes. They explained the various dials, what information each displayed, and how to interpret the outputs. One inscription was particularly revealing. It described a spiral dial on the back of the mechanism that displayed the 19-year Metonic cycle, the same cycle Price had identified from gear ratios. But the inscription provided details Price hadn't known. The spiral had 235 divisions, representing the 235 months in the Metonic cycle, 19 years times 12.37 months per year. As the user turned the input crank, a pointer would move along this spiral, showing the current position within the 19-year cycle. This allowed synchronization between the lunar calendar, based on moon phases, and the solar calendar, based on the sun's annual motion. Another inscription described an eclipse prediction dial. Ancient Greek astronomers had discovered the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years after which eclipses repeat in similar patterns. The mechanism included a dial showing this cycle, allowing users to predict when eclipses would occur. The inscription explained that eclipses were indicated by specific glyphs, with additional notation showing whether the eclipse would be solar or lunar and what time of day it would occur. These discoveries confirmed and expanded Price's theories. The mechanism was indeed a sophisticated calculator for astronomical phenomena. But it was more than Price had realized. It wasn't just showing planetary positions, it was predicting eclipses, correlating multiple calendar systems, and providing detailed information about lunar and solar cycles. This required not just mechanical sophistication, but deep astronomical knowledge and mathematical precision. The team tackled another puzzle, the mechanism's accuracy. How precise were its calculations? Ancient astronomical observations weren't as accurate as modern measurements. The Greeks didn't have telescopes or atomic clocks, but they were remarkably precise given their tools. Could the mechanism replicate that precision mechanically? The answer required detailed analysis of the gear ratios. Mike Edmonds led this investigation. He examined every gear pair, counting teeth precisely from the CT scans. The ratios between gears encoded astronomical periods. For example, the moon's synodic period, the time between full moons, is approximately 29.53 days. To represent this mechanically requires gears with a ratio very close to 29.53 to 1. The mechanism used gears with 53 and 96 teeth in one pair, and additional gears in the train, producing a ratio that approximated the lunar month to within a few minutes. Extraordinary precision for mechanical calculation. Even more impressive was how the mechanism handled complex astronomical phenomena. The planets don't move at constant speeds. They appear to speed up, slow down, and occasionally reverse direction, retrograde motion, as seen from Earth. Ancient Greek astronomers understood this, and it developed mathematical models to predict planetary positions despite these irregularities. The mechanism implemented these models mechanically, using combinations of gears and epicyclic gear trains, or gears mounted on other rotating gears, to replicate the observed planetary motions.
The team's reconstruction revealed that the mechanism's front dial showed the zodiac and the Egyptian calendar, a 365-day calendar without leap years, commonly used in Hellenistic astronomy. Pointers indicated the positions of the sun and moon through the zodiac. The moon pointer likely also showed the lunar phase through a black and white ball that rotated as the pointer moved. Additional pointers probably showed the 5 known planets, though the gears for some planets were lost or too damaged to reconstruct completely. The back of the mechanism contained 2 large spiral dials. The upper spiral displayed the Metonic cycle, 19 years divided into 235 months. The lower spiral displayed the Saros eclipse prediction cycle, 223 months, with markings indicating when eclipses would occur.
Subsidiary dials showed additional information: the Callipic cycle, a 76-year refinement of the Metonic cycle, and the Exeligmos cycle, a 54-year period after which eclipses repeat with similar characteristics. But one discovery challenged everything researchers thought they knew about the mechanism's origin. The CT scans revealed inscriptions mentioning games, specifically the Isthmian Games and the Nemean Games. These were pan-Hellenic athletic festivals, similar to the Olympics. Why would an astronomical calculator include references to athletic games? The answer lay in ancient Greek calendar systems. Different cities used different calendars, often synchronized to local festivals. The mechanism's calendar functions were customized for a specific location, somewhere that celebrated the Isthmian and the Nemean Games as major events. This pointed to Corinth or its colonies as the likely origin. The Isthmian Games were held at Corinth, and Nemea was in the Corinthian sphere of influence. This contradicted Derek Price's theory that the mechanism came from Rhodes. The debate intensified among researchers. Was Corinth the origin, or could Rhodes have celebrated these games as well? The evidence wasn't conclusive, but it suggested the mechanism's origin might be different from what Price had proposed. Another surprise came from detailed analysis of the gear cutting techniques. The gears showed tool marks, subtle traces of how they were manufactured. Researchers identified that the gears were cut using a precision device, probably a specialized gear cutting tool, or even a primitive form of dividing engine, a device for marking precise divisions. This implied the existence of specialized workshops equipped with advanced tools specifically for creating such mechanisms. This wasn't a one-off invention by a lone genius. It suggested an established tradition of instrument making. As the team published their findings between 2006 and 2008, the scientific community's reaction was overwhelming. Major journals including Nature published their research. Media coverage was extensive. The Antikythera mechanism became famous beyond academic circles, featured in documentaries, museum exhibitions, and popular science books. The device was called the world's first computer, ancient Greece's laptop, or the most complex artifact from antiquity. But the research also raised profound questions about ancient technology. If Greeks in the 2nd or 1st century BC could build something this sophisticated, what else could they build? Why didn't this tradition continue and develop? The Roman Empire that conquered Greece had impressive engineering achievements, aqueducts, roads, military technology, but showed no evidence of continuing Greek mechanical astronomy. Why was this knowledge lost? One theory suggested that such devices were rare and expensive, affordable only by wealthy patrons or institutions. When the centers of Greek learning declined, libraries burned, schools closed, scholars dispersed during the chaos of late antiquity, the knowledge died with its practitioners. The devices themselves were melted down for their valuable bronze. Only the Antikythera mechanism survived, preserved by the accident of shipwreck. Another theory proposed that the tradition wasn't entirely lost. It was transmitted to the Islamic world during the medieval period. Islamic astronomers created sophisticated astronomical instruments, including astrolabes and equatoria, that performed similar functions to the Antikythera mechanism. Perhaps they were inspired by Greek mechanical astronomy that survived in manuscripts or rare surviving instruments. Later, these Islamic instruments influenced European clockmakers in the Renaissance, eventually leading to mechanical clocks and modern precision instruments. The research team continued working, refining their reconstructions and attempting to build functional replicas. Several groups created working models based on the CT scan data. These models confirmed that the mechanism functioned as theorized. Turning the input crank caused all the dials to move, accurately calculating astronomical positions and predicting eclipses. The ancient device really worked, and worked remarkably well. But mysteries remained. The mechanism's exact date of manufacture was still debated. Estimates ranged from 150 BC to 100 BC.
The identity of its maker was unknown, though some researchers proposed it might have been constructed by followers of the mathematician and astronomer Hipparchus, who lived in the 2nd century BC and made crucial advances in astronomy. And while the team had decoded most of the mechanism's functions, some gear trains remained puzzling, their purposes not entirely clear. By 2010, the Antikythera mechanism had been transformed from an archaeological curiosity to perhaps the most studied single artifact from antiquity. It had revealed that ancient Greeks possessed technological sophistication that rivaled and in some ways exceeded anything achieved until the European Renaissance. It had forced historians to reassess their understanding of ancient science and engineering. And it had demonstrated that the ancient world contained wonders that modern archaeology was only beginning to discover. The mechanism sat in the National Archaeological Museum, now understood but still mysterious. The bronze fragments that had puzzled researchers for over a century had finally revealed their secrets. But each answer raised new questions. If this existed, what else had existed? What other ancient technologies had been lost? And what might still be waiting, undiscovered, in shipwrecks or buried ruins, ready to challenge everything we think we know about the past?
2014, marine archaeologists returned to the waters off Antikythera for the first time since the original 1900-1901 salvage operation. More than a century had passed, and technology had advanced dramatically. Modern diving equipment allowed divers to work safely at 60 meters for extended periods. Underwater robots could survey areas impossible for human divers to reach. Advanced sonar could map the seafloor in detail, revealing objects buried under sediment. The new expedition, led by the Hellenic Effort of Underwater Antiquities and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, aimed to determine what remained at the wreck site and whether additional artifacts, perhaps even pieces of the mechanism itself, might still be recovered. The first task was surveying the entire area. In 1900, the sponge divers had worked within a limited zone, recovering only what they could easily reach and move. Modern survey technology revealed the wreck site was much larger than previously understood. The ship had broken apart as it sank, scattering cargo across a debris field stretching over 300 meters. The 1900 expedition had only excavated a small portion of the total site. Using metal detectors and sub-bottom profilers, the team identified numerous anomalies, objects buried under sand and sediment, invisible to the 1900 divers. In 2014, they recovered a bronze spear, possibly from the ship's armament or cargo. In 2015, they found a partial skeleton, the first human remains ever recovered from the wreck. DNA analysis revealed it was a young man, probably crew or a passenger. His bones were sent for advanced analysis, hoping to determine where he came from, what he ate, perhaps even identify genetic relationships to modern populations. But the most exciting possibility was that fragments of the Antikythera mechanism itself might still be at the site. The mechanism found in 1901 was clearly incomplete. Gears were missing. Inscriptions referenced components that weren't present in the recovered fragments. If those missing pieces could be found, they might reveal functions that researchers still debated, answering questions about planetaria displays or calendar calculations that remained uncertain. The new excavations were slow and methodical. Unlike the 1900 operation, which was essentially salvage focused on recovering valuable objects quickly, the modern expedition treated the site as an archaeological investigation. Every artifact's position was documented with GPS coordinates. Every object was photographed in situ before recovery. Sediment samples were collected for analysis. This approach yielded far more information, but also meant that finding small mechanism fragments among the debris would be extremely difficult. Meanwhile, research on the existing mechanism fragments continued using ever-advancing technology. In 2016, researchers applied polynomial texture mapping,
a photographic technique that captures surface details under different lighting angles, allowing digital reconstruction of worn or damaged inscriptions. This technique revealed text that had been invisible in earlier examinations. Additional letters and words emerged from surfaces worn nearly smooth by corrosion. One particularly significant discovery from the enhanced inscription reading concerned the mechanism's calendar. Researchers had assumed it used the Egyptian calendar, a 365-day calendar without leap years that was standard in Hellenistic astronomy. But new inscription readings revealed month names that didn't match the Egyptian calendar. They matched calendars used in Corinthian colonies, specifically the calendar of Syracusan-influenced regions. This strengthened the theory that the mechanism originated in Corinth, or one of its colonies, possibly Syracuse itself. Syracuse was an intriguing possibility. The great mathematician Archimedes had lived in Syracuse, 287 to 212 BC, and ancient sources mentioned he'd built mechanical devices, including planetaria. Could the Antikythera mechanism be connected to an Archimedean tradition of mechanical astronomy? The timeline was problematic. The mechanism was built perhaps 100 years after Archimedes' death. But intellectual traditions persist across generations. The mechanism might represent the culmination of a tradition that Archimedes initiated. In 2017, researchers using advanced computer modeling made another discovery about the mechanism's front dial. Earlier reconstructions had shown pointers indicating the Sun, Moon, and 5 planets. But the planetary display remained puzzling. How exactly did it work? The surviving fragments didn't include complete planetary mechanisms for all 5 planets. Researchers could reconstruct Mercury and Venus from surviving gears, but Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn were more problematic. Dr. Tony Freeth and his collaborator David Higgin proposed an innovative solution. They suggested the planetary mechanisms used a technique that wouldn't be reinvented until medieval Islamic astronomy and later European Renaissance mechanics. A method of using epicyclic gears, or gears mounted on other rotating gears, and variable speed drives to model irregular planetary motions. Using this approach, they created a digital reconstruction showing how all 5 planets could be displayed on the front dial using gear trains that fit within the mechanism's available space. It was elegant and mechanically plausible. But could ancient Greeks really have developed such sophisticated techniques? The skepticism that had greeted earlier Antikythera research persisted. Critics argued that the reconstructions were too speculative, that modern researchers were attributing capabilities to the ancient device that exceeded actual ancient knowledge. The debate continued, as it had for over a century. New evidence supporting the mechanism's sophistication came from an unexpected source: ancient texts. Classical scholars began systematically reviewing Greek and Roman literature, looking for references to mechanical devices that earlier historians had dismissed or misunderstood. They found numerous mentions of mechanical marvels, astronomical instruments, and sphere-making as a recognized craft in the ancient world. Cicero's writings mentioned multiple times that Greek craftsmen built devices showing planetary motions. He specifically described a device made by Posidonius that displayed the sun, moon, and planets with motions synchronized to match reality. Historians had previously assumed these references were metaphorical or described simple models. But the Antikythera mechanism proved such devices actually existed. Perhaps Cicero's descriptions were literal. He was reporting actual mechanisms he'd seen in Rome, brought from Greece as curiosities or scholarly instruments.
Even more intriguing were references in texts about Archimedes. After Syracuse fell to Rome in 212 BC, Roman general Marcellus supposedly took 2 devices that Archimedes had built, both described as showing celestial motions. One was given to a temple as a dedication, the other Marcellus kept personally. These devices were mentioned by multiple ancient authors, including Cicero and Ovid. Perhaps these were predecessors to the Antikythera mechanism, built by the greatest mathematician of antiquity. In 2020, researchers published a comprehensive analysis of the mechanism's eclipse prediction capabilities. The Sorrow style on the device's back predicted eclipses over an 18-year cycle. But the new research showed the mechanism did more than just indicate when eclipses would occur. The inscriptions and gear arrangements allowed it to predict eclipse characteristics, whether solar or lunar, what time of day the eclipse would peak, and even an estimate of the eclipse magnitude, how much of the sun or moon would be covered. This level of detail required sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The ancient Greeks would have needed extensive observational records of past eclipses, mathematical models to predict future ones, and understanding of the geometry of eclipses, the alignment of sun, moon, and earth. All this knowledge was encoded into the mechanism's gears and inscriptions. It was essentially a portable eclipse prediction computer, allowing users to look up any date within the Sara cycle and determine eclipse information without complex calculations. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 to 2021 disrupted research and excavation, but work continued remotely using digital models and archived data. Researchers from multiple countries collaborated virtually, sharing 3D models, CT scan data, and inscription photographs. This distributed research model actually accelerated some aspects of the work. Different teams could work simultaneously on different problems, sharing results instantly. One team focused on the mechanism's manufacturing techniques, examining CT scans for evidence of how the gears were made. They identified tool marks showing that the gear teeth were cut, not cast. This meant the ancient craftsmen used specialized cutting tools, probably guided by dividing instruments that allowed precise spacing of teeth. The quality of the gear cutting was remarkable. Modern measurements showed tooth spacing variations of less than 1%, equivalent to quality achievable with good modern equipment. Another research group examined the bronze alloy composition using non-invasive spectroscopy techniques. The bronze was a tin bronze alloy, typical of ancient Greek metalworking. But the composition was carefully controlled. The tin percentage was optimal for strength and workability. This suggested the mechanism's makers had access to quality materials and understood metallurgy well enough to specify appropriate alloys for precision mechanical components. In 2022, new excavations at the Antikythera site recovered a bronze disc with gear teeth, immediately sparking speculation that it might be part of the mechanism. Detailed examination proved disappointing. The disc size and tooth count didn't match any missing components from the known mechanism, but the find demonstrated that complex bronze mechanisms weren't unique. Perhaps other devices existed, increasing the likelihood that the Antikythera mechanism represented a tradition rather than a singular invention. Throughout the 2010s and early 2020s, multiple groups built working replicas of the mechanism. These weren't just models. They were functional devices that could actually calculate astronomical positions. Builders used both ancient techniques, hand-cutting bronze gears, and modern methods, computer-aided design and manufacturing. The replicas confirmed that the mechanism worked as theorized and demonstrated that it could be built with technology available in ancient Greece. One replica builder, Michael Wright, a former curator at the Science Museum in London, spent years creating an extraordinarily accurate reconstruction. Wright's replica included his own theories about how certain mechanisms worked, sometimes differing from other researchers' reconstructions. These differences sparked productive debates. By building and testing different approaches, researchers could determine which mechanisms actually functioned correctly and which were mechanically problematic. The replicas also allowed researchers to use the mechanism as the ancients would have, actually calculating astronomical phenomena and comparing results to modern calculations. The mechanism proved remarkably accurate. For simple calculations like the sun's position or moon phase, it was accurate within a day or two over decades. For more complex calculations like planetary positions, Accuracy degraded over time due to small errors accumulating, but for periods of several years, the mechanism produced useful predictions. By 2024, the Antikythera mechanism had become one of the most studied artifacts in archaeology. Hundreds of papers had been published, dozens of documentaries produced, multiple museum exhibitions mounted. The mechanism had inspired modern makers, watchmakers, engineers, and astronomers. It had become a symbol of ancient human ingenuity, demonstrating that our ancestors were far more capable than modern people often assumed. But for all the research, mysteries remained. Who exactly built it? Was it made by a known individual or an anonymous craftsman? Where precisely was it made? Corinth, Syracuse, Rhodes, or somewhere else entirely? What happened to the tradition? How did knowledge this sophisticated get lost? And most intriguingly, what other ancient technologies existed that we haven't discovered yet? The Antikythera mechanism had revealed one ancient secret, but it had also proven that the ancient world contained knowledge and capabilities that modern archaeology was only beginning to uncover. Every shipwreck, every excavation, every new discovery had the potential to overturn historical assumptions. The mechanism wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, the first glimpse into an ancient technological world we were only starting to understand.
After examining over a century of research, archaeological investigation, technological analysis, and scholarly debate, we must ask the fundamental questions. What is the truth about the Antikythera mechanism? What does it tell us about ancient civilization? And what mysteries still remain after all this study? Start with what we know with absolute certainty. The Antikythera mechanism is genuine, an ancient Greek artifact dating to approximately 150 to 100 BC, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck that sank around 65 BC. This isn't speculation or theory. The archaeological context is solid. The bronze corrosion patterns are consistent with 2,000 years underwater. The Greek inscriptions use language and letter forms specific to the Hellenistic period. Carbon dating of organic materials from the shipwreck confirms the 1st century BC timeframe. The mechanism is authentically ancient. We also know what it did. This is no longer mysterious. The device was a mechanical calculator designed to predict astronomical phenomena and correlate different calendar systems. The user would turn an input crank, causing internal gears to rotate at different speeds representing the motions of celestial bodies. Output dials on the front and back displayed the calculated information: positions of the sun, moon, and planets through the zodiac, the phase of the moon, a 19-year calendar cycle, and predictions of solar and lunar eclipses over an 18-year period. The mechanism's calculations were based on advanced Greek astronomy. It incorporated the Metonic cycle, 19 years equals 235 lunar months, the Calippic cycle, 76 years, a refinement of the Metonic, the Saros eclipse cycle, 223 months between similar eclipses, and the Exeligmos cycle, 54 years after which eclipses repeat with similar characteristics. It modeled the moon's variable speed using a pin and slot mechanism that replicated lunar anomaly. It likely displayed planetary positions using epicyclic geotrains that approximated the irregular motions of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The precision was remarkable. Gear ratios achieved astronomical accuracy within fractions of a percent. For example, the lunar month mechanism was accurate to within minutes over many years. The manufacturing quality was extraordinary, with gear teeth spaced evenly within 1% tolerance. The inscriptions were comprehensive, providing an instruction manual with approximately 3,500 characters of text explaining how to use the device and interpret its outputs. These facts are established. but several crucial questions remain debated among researchers. Question 1. Who built it? We don't know the mechanism's maker. No name appears in the surviving inscriptions. The craftsmanship suggests a skilled instrument maker, someone with deep knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and mechanical engineering. Several candidates have been proposed based on historical evidence. Archimedes, 287 to 212 BC, is frequently mentioned, despite living too early to have built this specific device. Ancient sources credit Archimedes with creating mechanical spheres displaying celestial notions. If Archimedes established a tradition of mechanical astronomy, the Antikythera mechanism might represent that tradition's continuation by later craftsmen. Hipparchus, 190 to 120 BC, is another candidate. Many of the astronomical parameters encoded in the mechanism's gears correspond to values Hipparchus calculated: the length of the lunar month, the timing of eclipses, the precession of the equinoxes. The mechanism might embody Hipparchus's astronomical theories in mechanical form, built by him or his followers. Posidonius, 135 to 51 BC, is compelling because he lived at the right time, and ancient sources specifically mention he built devices showing planetary motions. Cicero saw such a device, describing it in his writings. If the shipwreck date of 65 BC is accurate, Posidonius could have built this mechanism shortly before the ship sank. Or perhaps the maker was anonymous, a skilled craftsman whose name wasn't recorded because instrument making, while respected, didn't confer the same fame as philosophy or politics. The ancient world had many capable engineers whose names history never preserved. Question 2. Where was it made? The origin location has shifted from early theories. Derek Price proposed Rhodes based on the island's reputation for mechanical engineering and astronomy. But inscription evidence pointing to Corinthian calendars suggests Corinth or one of its colonies, possibly Syracuse or even Epirus in northwestern Greece. Each location has supporting evidence. Rhodes had a famous school of astronomy and engineering. Corinth was a major commercial center with resources to support luxury craftsmen. Syracuse had the Archimedean connection. The truth is, we simply don't know. The mechanism could have been made in one location and sold to a buyer in another. The shipwreck was transporting it somewhere, probably to Rome given the cargo of Greek art intended for Roman collectors, but that doesn't tell us where it originated. Question 3. How many existed? Was the Antikythera mechanism unique, or did similar devices exist throughout the ancient Greek and Roman world? The evidence suggests it wasn't unique. Ancient texts mention multiple such devices. Cicero described at least 2 different mechanisms showing planetary motions. References to sphere makers as a recognized profession suggest an established craft tradition. Archimedes supposedly built multiple mechanical demonstrations. But if these devices were common, why did only one survive? The answer is probably economic and practical. Bronze was valuable and recycled constantly. A broken or obsolete mechanism would be melted down, the metal reused. The Antikythera mechanism only survived because it sank before anyone could salvage it, and the seawater corrosion that damaged it also sealed it in protective concretion that prevented complete destruction. So the mechanism probably represented a tradition, not a unique invention. Perhaps dozens, even hundreds of such devices existed over the 3 centuries from Archimedes to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They were owned by wealthy individuals, institutions, philosophers, and astronomers. When the mechanism broke or the owner died, most were melted down. Only this one, through pure chance, survived for modern archaeology to discover. Question 4. Why was the tradition lost? This is perhaps the most profound question. Ancient Greeks achieved mechanical sophistication with the Antikythera mechanism that Europe wouldn't match until the 14th century AD with mechanical astronomical clocks. That's over 1,300 years. How did this knowledge disappear? Several factors likely contributed. First, such devices were expensive and rare, owned by a small elite. When Roman expansion disrupted Greek society, many centers of learning declined. Libraries burned, most famously Alexandria's library. Schools closed. Scholars dispersed or died without passing knowledge to students. The practical craft knowledge held by instrument makers died with them when the market for expensive astronomical calculators disappeared. Second, the Roman Empire, while appreciative of Greek culture, didn't emphasize mechanical astronomy. Romans were superb engineers for practical purposes, aqueducts, roads, military equipment, but they didn't continue Greek traditions of theoretical astronomy and mechanical modeling of the heavens. Without Roman patronage and interest, the tradition withered. Third, the rise of Christianity changed intellectual priorities. Early Christian scholars were less interested in mechanical cosmological models and more focused on theology and biblical interpretation. Astronomical instruments were sometimes viewed with suspicion as potentially associated with astrology, which the Church condemned. The tradition had no cultural support in late antiquity and the early medieval period. But the knowledge wasn't completely lost. It was partially transmitted to the Islamic world. Medieval Islamic astronomers created sophisticated instruments, including astrolabes, equatoria, and mechanical clocks. These devices performed similar functions to the Antikythera mechanism, using similar principles, complex gear trains modeling astronomical cycles. Islamic scholars preserved Greek astronomical texts and built upon them, creating instruments that eventually influenced European Renaissance instrument makers. When European clockmakers in the 14th century began creating mechanical astronomical clocks, they might have been rediscovering principles that the Islamic world had preserved from ancient Greece. The Antikythera mechanism's knowledge wasn't entirely erased. It was transformed, transmitted across cultures, and eventually contributed to the technology that would develop into modern science and engineering. The larger truth: the Antikythera mechanism forces us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about ancient civilization. For centuries, history depicted technological progress as a steady upward trajectory, each generation building on the previous, gradually advancing from primitive to sophisticated. The mechanism proves that model is false. Ancient societies achieved remarkable sophistication in specific areas. Then that knowledge was lost, requiring later societies to rediscover or reinvent it. This pattern appears throughout history. The Romans made concrete that modern engineers couldn't replicate until the 20th century. Medieval Islamic opticians understood refraction principles that Europeans rediscovered in the Renaissance. Chinese engineers built seismographs in the 2nd century AD that Europe wouldn't match until the 19th century. Knowledge and technology aren't automatically preserved or transmitted. They require active maintenance through cultural institutions, education, and economic support. The Antikythera mechanism also demonstrates that our ancestors weren't less intelligent than modern people. They lacked our accumulated knowledge and technological infrastructure, but their intellectual capacity was identical. Given the right circumstances, stable society, economic resources, cultural support for inquiry, ancient engineers and scientists achieved extraordinary things. The mechanism proves that human ingenuity has always been capable of brilliance when conditions permit. What still waits to be discovered? The Antikythera Shipwreck site isn't fully excavated. Modern surveys have identified objects still buried in sediment, possibly including more mechanism fragments or even other devices. Ongoing excavations continue slowly, methodically, with each season potentially bringing new discoveries. And Antikythera isn't unique. The Mediterranean contains thousands of ancient shipwrecks, most never excavated or even properly surveyed. How many contain lost technologies? How many mechanisms, instruments, or devices sit on the seafloor waiting for discovery? The Antikythera mechanism isn't the most sophisticated object the ancient world created. It's simply the most sophisticated that happened to survive and be found.
On land, countless ancient sites remain unexcavated. Libraries burned, temples were destroyed, cities were abandoned. The artifacts and texts they contained are lost, but some might be recovered through archaeology. Each excavation has potential to reveal capabilities we didn't know ancient civilizations possessed. The lesson of the Antikythera mechanism is humility. We don't know what we don't know. History is written by what survives, and survival is largely random. The mechanism survived by accident, shipwreck, seawater preservation, discovery by divers who reported it rather than looting it, storage in a museum where it could be studied. How many similar wonders weren't so lucky? The ancient world was more sophisticated than we've believed. It contained knowledge and technology that challenges modern assumptions. The Antikythera mechanism isn't an anomaly. It's a window into a world of lost capabilities. A world where engineers built computers from bronze gears, where craftsmen achieved precision we didn't think possible, where knowledge was more advanced than history remembered. And somewhere beneath the Mediterranean, or buried in desert sands, or sitting in museum storage rooms cataloged as unidentified bronze fragment, other mechanisms might wait. Other devices that will force us to rewrite history again. Other proofs that our ancestors were more brilliant, more capable, more sophisticated than the victorious march of modern progress lets us imagine. The Antikythera mechanism has taught us to question our assumptions about the past. It has proven that ancient people could achieve technological wonders, and it has shown us that history contains secrets waiting to be discovered. Secrets that will continue surprising us, challenging us, and forcing us to recognize that human ingenuity has always been extraordinary, regardless of the era. The mechanism has revealed its secrets, but the ancient world has not.